Welcome tonight. We are going to talk about the Comanche people. In the vast expanse of North American history, few peoples have captured the imagination and commanded the respect of both friend and foe, quite like the Comanche. For nearly 2 centuries, they dominated the southern plains, creating an empire that stretched across hundreds of thousands of square miles, from the Arkansas River in the north to the deserts of northern Mexico in the south, from the eastern reaches of New Mexico to the frontiers of Texas and beyond. They were warriors of unparalleled skill, horsemen so accomplished that observers often claimed they seemed to be one with their mounts, and a society so adaptive and resilient that they transformed themselves from mountain dwellers to masters of the plains in less than a century. The story of the Comanche is one of transformation, of a people who seized opportunity when it presented itself and built something remarkable from it. It is a story of freedom and power, of cultural richness and military prowess, of adaptation and survival in the face of overwhelming change. It is also a story tinged with tragedy, as the inexorable advance of Euro-American settlement ultimately brought an end to their independence and forever changed their way of life. Tonight we will journey through the centuries of Comanche history, from their origins in the mountains and basins of the Great Basin, through their explosive expansion onto the plains, their golden age of dominance, their desperate struggle to maintain their freedom, and finally to their forced transition to reservation life and their persistence into the modern era. We will meet their great leaders, understand their complex society, witness their military genius, and come to appreciate why, for a time, they were the most formidable military force on the southern plains, a power that held both the Spanish Empire and later the American and Mexican nations at bay. So settle in, let your mind wander across the endless grasslands of the southern plains, feel the thunder of hooves across the prairie, and prepare to immerse yourself in the epic saga of the Comanche people. Origins in the mountains. To understand the Comanche, we must first understand where they came from, and that journey begins not on the wide open plains, but in the mountains and high country of the Great Basin region, in what is today the state of Wyoming and the surrounding areas. The Comanche are a Shoshonean people belonging to the Uto-Aztecan language family, and their linguistic relatives include the various Shoshone bands of the Great Basin, the Paiute, and more distantly, the Hopi, and even the Nahuatl-speaking peoples of Mexico. In those early centuries before the arrival of Europeans fundamentally altered the ecology and power dynamics of North America, the people who would become the Comanche lived a life adapted to the harsh, unforgiving environment of the Great Basin and Rocky Mountain region. This was a land of extremes, where summers could be scorching and winters brutally cold, where water was often scarce and game sometimes difficult to find. The people lived in small, mobile bands, following the seasonal patterns of game animals and edible plants, constantly moving to take advantage of whatever resources were available. Life was hard but sustainable. The people hunted deer, elk, bighorn sheep, and smaller game. They gathered pine nuts, roots, seeds, and berries. They fished in the mountain streams and lakes. Their material culture was necessarily simple and portable, as they had to carry everything they owned on their backs or on simple dog-drawn travois. They lived in temporary shelters made from brush and bark, easily constructed and easily abandoned as the band moved on to new territory. The social organization of these pre-Comanche people was based on the extended family band. Leadership was informal and based on consensus, with particularly skilled hunters or wise elders carrying more influence, but no one holding formal authority over others. It was an egalitarian society by necessity, as survival in such an environment required cooperation and the pooling of resources and knowledge. Everyone had a role to play, from the youngest children learning to gather plants to the oldest members passing down crucial survival skills and knowledge of the land. But the world was changing. Far to the south and east, Spanish conquistadors had arrived in the Americas at the end of the 15th century. Over the following decades and centuries, Spanish settlement gradually expanded northward from Mexico into what would become the American Southwest. And with the Spanish came something that would revolutionize life for the peoples of the Great Plains and fundamentally alter the trajectory of Shoshonean peoples living in the mountains: the horse. The Horse Revolution. The Spanish brought horses to the Americas, descendants of the animals that had evolved in North America millions of years ago, then migrated to Eurasia before going extinct in their homeland during the last ice age. Now they returned, carried in the holds of Spanish ships, and they would transform the continent once again. At first, the Spanish zealously guarded their horses, recognizing them as a key military advantage over indigenous peoples. But animals have a way of escaping human control, and over time, through a combination of theft, trade, and the escape of wild herds, horses began to spread northward from New Spain. By the late 17th century, horses were filtering into the Great Basin and the surrounding regions. For the Shoshonean peoples living there, the arrival of the horse was nothing short of revolutionary. Suddenly, these people who had traveled on foot or with dog travois had access to an animal that could carry heavy loads, move much faster than any human could walk, and dramatically expand the range over which a band could operate. The implications were staggering. But even more significant than the practical advantages of the horse was what lay to the south and east: the Great Plains. For countless generations, the Great Plains had been home to various peoples, but it had also been a challenging environment for those without horses. The distances were vast, the buffalo herds moved constantly, and without the ability to cover ground quickly, making full use of the plains' resources was difficult. Now, with horses, that changed, and some of the Shoshonean bands living in the mountains and on the edge of the plains saw the opportunity before them. Around the late 1600s or early 1700s, the exact timing is debated by historians but likely occurred in waves over several decades. Some of these bands began moving southward and eastward onto the plains. They followed the horses, followed the buffalo, followed the promise of a richer, more abundant life than the mountains could provide. These people, these southward migrating Shoshonean bands, were the Comanche. The name itself likely comes from the Ute word Comanche, meaning those who are against us or those who want to fight us, as the Comanche and Ute, despite their linguistic relationship, often found themselves in conflict. The Comanche called themselves Numanu, or Numanu, meaning the people, a designation common to many indigenous nations when referring to themselves. The transformation from mountain people to plains people happened with remarkable speed. Within a generation or two, the Comanche had become some of the finest horsemen the world has ever seen. They adapted their entire society, culture, and way of life around the horse and around the pursuit of the buffalo. Children learned to ride before they could walk. Warriors could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from a galloping horse, sliding down the side of their mount to use its body as a shield while firing arrows from beneath its neck. They could mount and dismount at full gallop, could catch and break wild horses, and could cover enormous distances in a day's ride. The Southern Plains and early expansion. As the Comanche moved onto the southern plains in the early 18th century, they entered a region already occupied by other peoples. The Southern Plains, the vast grasslands stretching across what is now western Texas, western Oklahoma, eastern New Mexico, and parts of Kansas, Colorado, and Mexico. were home to Apache bands, particularly the Lipan Apache in the south and various Plains Apache groups. The Apache had themselves moved onto the plains earlier and had developed a mixed economy of hunting, farming in favorable locations, and raiding. But the Comanche arrival changed everything. The Comanche came with horses, with riding skills honed to perfection, and with a military prowess that quickly became legendary. They also came in increasing numbers, as more and more Shoshonean bands migrated south to join those already on the plains, attracted by stories of the wealth and freedom to be found there. The result was a gradual but inexorable displacement of the Apache from the southern plains. This was not a single war or conflict, but rather a decades-long process of raids, skirmishes, and battles that eventually forced most Apache bands either southward into the desert regions of the Southwest or westward into the mountains of New Mexico. The Comanche were not deliberately genocidal. They took Apache captives, particularly women and children, who were often adopted into Comanche bands, but they were absolutely committed to controlling the territory they had claimed. By the mid-18th century, the Comanche had established themselves as the dominant power on the southern plains. They had developed a society perfectly adapted to the plains environment and to the exploitation of the one resource that defined plains life: the buffalo. The buffalo provided everything: meat for food, hides for shelter and clothing, bones for tools, sinew for bowstring and thread, horns for utensils, even dried dung for fuel where wood was scarce. The Comanche developed techniques for preserving buffalo meat through drying and making pemmican, allowing them to store food for leaner times. They became experts at reading the land, at predicting where buffalo herds would be and how they would move with the seasons. The Comanche social structure evolved to match their new environment. The people organized themselves into divisions or bands, sometimes called rancherias by the Spanish. These divisions were not rigid political units, but rather loose confederations of local bands that shared territory and cultural affinity. The major divisions that emerged included the Penatica, honey eaters, in the south, the Noconi, those who turn back, in the central region, the Kotsotika, buffalo eaters, in the north, the Yamparica, yap eaters or potato eaters, in the west, and the Quahadi, antelope, in the northwest. Each division maintained its own hunting grounds and had its own preferred camping areas, though these boundaries were flexible, and bands from different divisions often cooperated or intermarried. Within each division, the basic unit was the local band, typically consisting of several extended families totaling anywhere from a few dozen to a few hundred people. Each band had one or more chiefs, but leadership remained based largely on consensus and the personal qualities of the leader. A chief maintained his position through generosity, wisdom, and demonstrated skill in war and hunting. If people became dissatisfied with a chief's leadership, they could simply leave and join another band. Freedom of movement and association was a fundamental value in Comanche society. Society and culture. To understand the Comanche at their height, we must understand how their society functioned, what they valued, and how they organized their lives. Comanche culture was shaped by the demands and opportunities of plains life, by the centrality of the horse to all they did, and by a fierce commitment to personal freedom and autonomy. The family was the foundation of Comanche society. Marriages were typically arranged, with the groom's family providing gifts to the bride's family, particularly horses, which had become the primary measure of wealth. A successful warrior or hunter might have multiple wives. Polygyny was accepted and even respected, as it demonstrated a man's ability to provide for a large family. Wives in a polygynous marriage were often sisters, which helped maintain harmony in the household. Children were cherished, and rarely punished physically. Instead, children learned through observation, imitation, and gentle correction. Boys began learning to ride and hunt from a very young age, starting with small bows and arrows to hunt birds and rabbits, before graduating to larger weapons and more challenging prey. Girls learned the crucial skills of processing hides, making clothing, preserving food, and maintaining the household. Both boys and girls learned the stories and traditions of their people, the vast body of knowledge about the land and its resources, and the values that defined Comanche culture. When a boy killed his first buffalo or achieved his first coup in battle, striking an enemy with a special stick called a coup stick, which was considered a greater honor than killing from a distance, it was cause for celebration. The boy was recognized as having taken a step toward manhood. For girls, the onset of menstruation marked transition to womanhood and was marked with ceremony and instruction in the additional responsibilities they would now bear. The Comanche were a warrior society, and military prowess was the primary path to status and respect for men. But warfare in Comanche culture was quite different from European-style warfare. The goal was not typically to seize and hold territory. The plains were vast and largely undefended anyway, but rather to gain wealth, particularly horses, and to demonstrate personal courage and skill. Raids were the primary form of warfare. A raid might be organized by any respected warrior, who would invite others to join him. Participation was always voluntary. No one could compel another to join a war party. These raids targeted enemy camps, and the goal was to steal horses and capture other valuable goods while inflicting and sustaining minimal casualties. A successful raid was one where the raiders came home wealthy in horses and without losing any of their own people. Stealth, speed, and surprise were valued far more than direct confrontation. However, the Comanche were also formidable in direct combat when circumstances required it. They fought as light cavalry, using their mobility to devastating effect. Armed with bows, lances, and later firearms, Comanche warriors could launch attacks with terrifying speed, inflict damage, and withdraw before slower-moving enemies could effectively respond. They were masters of the feigned retreat, drawing enemies into ambushes or simply exhausting them in futile pursuit. The spiritual life of the Comanche was rich and deeply personal. Like many plains peoples, the Comanche believed in a world filled with spiritual power. This power could reside in animals, in natural features like mountains or springs, in the weather, in the heavenly bodies. Through vision quests undertaken alone in isolation, individuals could make contact with the spiritual world and receive puha, medicine or power that would help them in life. This power might be for healing, for skill in war, for success in hunting, or for any number of other purposes. Medicine men and women were those who had particularly strong puha and who knew how to use it. They could heal the sick, interpret omens, and provide spiritual guidance. But puha was not the exclusive domain of medicine people. Any individual could possess it and use it, though some had more than others, and some knew better how to channel it. The Comanche also practiced the sun dance, though their version differed somewhat from that of other plains tribes. The sun dance was a communal religious ceremony held in summer when multiple bands gathered together. It involved fasting, dancing, and for some participants, self-torture through piercing of the chest or back, with skewers attached to the sun dance pole. Through this ordeal, dancers sought visions and demonstrated their courage and devotion. Socially, the Comanche valued generosity, courage, and loyalty. A man who hoarded his wealth rather than sharing it with those in need was despised. A warrior who showed cowardice in battle brought shame not only on himself, but on his family. Loyalty to one's band and family was paramount. The Comanche would go to great lengths to avenge a wronged kinsman or to rescue captured relatives. At the same time, the Comanche were ruthless toward enemies. Captives, particularly adult male captives from enemy tribes, could expect little mercy. Torture of captured warriors was practiced, serving both as vengeance for Comanche losses and as a demonstration of the captive's courage or lack thereof. However, women and children taken captive were typically adopted into Comanche bands. Captive children, especially those taken young, were often raised as Comanche and could grow to become full members of society. This practice allowed the Comanche to sustain and even increase their population despite occasional losses in warfare. Comancheria, the Empire of the Southern Plains. By the mid-18th century, the Comanche had created something unprecedented: an effective empire on the Southern Plains, a vast territory that came to be known as Comancheria. This was not an empire in the European sense, with centralized government and formal administrative structures. Rather, it was a zone of Comanche dominance, a territory across which Comanche bands ranged freely, where they controlled access to resources and where they dictated terms to those who wished to trade or travel through their lands. Comancheria at its height stretched roughly from the Arkansas River in Kansas southward to the Balcones Escarpment in Texas, and from the foothills of the Rocky Mountains eastward to the Cross Timbers. It encompassed most of the Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma, parts of Kansas, eastern New Mexico, and extended into northern Mexico. Across this vast territory, the Comanche were the law. They decided who could hunt there, who could trade there, who could pass through. The Comanche enforced their dominance through their military power, but they were also pragmatic. They were willing to establish peaceful trade relationships with groups that recognized their authority and were willing to trade on Comanche terms. The Comanche became enthusiastic traders, recognizing that they could obtain through trade things that would be difficult or impossible to produce themselves, while exchanging items they had in abundance. Horses were the most important trade commodity. The Comanche had become expert horse breeders and always maintained vast herds. They raided deep into Mexico and Texas for horses, sometimes returning with hundreds or even thousands of animals. These horses they traded northward to other plains tribes, eastward to American traders, and westward to Pueblo peoples and Spanish settlements in New Mexico. In return, they received metal goods, pots, knives, hatchets, and weapons, as well as cloth, beads, and other manufactured goods. The Comanche also traded in captives. People captured in raids, particularly Mexican women and children and Anglo-American settlers, became commodities. The Comanche might keep some captives for adoption or ransom, but many were traded to other tribes or to Spanish, Mexican, or American traders. This trade in human beings was brutal and traumatic for those caught up in it, but it was also a significant source of Comanche wealth and political leverage. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Comancheria was how the Comanche managed to maintain their independence and power despite facing three different colonial empires that were, at least in theory, much more powerful. From the south, they faced Spanish Mexico. From the east, they faced first French Louisiana, then, after 1803, the United States. And all around them they interacted with numerous other indigenous nations, some friendly, some hostile. Relations with Spain and Mexico. The relationship between the Comanche and the Spanish Empire was complex and evolved over time. Initially, the Spanish viewed the Comanche as a threat. Comanche raids into New Mexico and Texas targeted Spanish settlements and Pueblo villages, making off with horses, cattle, and captives. The Spanish launched military expeditions against the Comanche, but these achieved little success. The Comanche were too mobile, the plains too vast, and the Spanish simply could not match Comanche mounted warfare on the open prairie. A turning point came in 1786 when the Spanish governor of New Mexico, Juan Bautista de Anza, successfully negotiated a peace agreement with several Comanche divisions. The catalyst for this agreement was the death of the powerful Comanche chief Cuerno Verde, Green Horn, in battle with Spanish forces the previous year. With this influential war leader gone, other Comanche chiefs were more willing to consider peace. The resulting agreement was remarkable. The Spanish recognized Comanche dominance over the southern plains and agreed to regular trade. The Comanche, in turn, agreed to stop raiding New Mexico and to help Spanish forces against the Apache, who were now the common enemy of both the Spanish and the Comanche. Trade fairs were established at Taos and other locations where Comanche and Spanish could meet under truce to exchange goods. For several decades, this peace largely held. The Comanche found it more profitable to trade with the Spanish than to raid them, at least in New Mexico. They continued to raid into Texas and deep into Mexico, but northern New Mexico enjoyed relative peace. The Comanche became essential trading partners for the Spanish frontier settlements, which depended on Comanche trade for horses and buffalo robes. When Mexico achieved independence from Spain in 1821, the new Mexican government inherited the relationship with the Comanche. Unfortunately, the Mexican state was far weaker than the Spanish Empire had been. Mexico was torn by internal political conflicts, lacked the resources to maintain strong frontier defenses, and was unable to maintain the regular trade that had characterized Spanish-Comanche relations. The result was a catastrophe for northern Mexico. Comanche raids into Texas, Coahuila, Chihuahua, and other northern Mexican states intensified dramatically. Entire regions were depopulated as Mexican settlers fled southward. The Comanche conducted audacious raids hundreds of miles deep into Mexican territory, sometimes reaching nearly to Mexico City itself. They captured thousands of Mexicans, killed thousands more, and made off with uncounted numbers of horses, mules, cattle, and other goods. The Mexican government tried repeatedly to stop the raids or negotiate peace, but without success. The Comanche had learned that raiding Mexico was enormously profitable and relatively risk-free. Mexican military forces were no match for Comanche mobility and fighting skill. By the 1830s and 1840s, the Comanche had created what some historians call a disaster zone across much of northern Mexico, a region where effective Mexican authority had ceased to exist and where Comanche raiding parties roamed almost at will. The Texas frontier, the relationship between the Comanche and the Anglo-American settlers of Texas, was one of the most consequential conflicts in North American history. When Anglo settlers began arriving in Texas in the 1820s under the Mexican government's colonization program, they initially came into contact with the southern Comanche divisions, particularly the Penatica. For a time, relations were relatively peaceful. The Anglo settlers were few in number, and the Comanche were willing to trade with them. But Anglo settlement continued to expand, particularly after Texas won independence from Mexico in 1836. The new Republic of Texas claimed sovereignty over a vast territory, much of it actually controlled by the Comanche. The Texans wanted the land for cotton cultivation and cattle ranching, which meant they wanted the Comanche gone. The Comanche had no intention of leaving and considered the Texan claims to Comancheria to be ridiculous. The result was conflict, sporadic at first, but gradually intensifying. The Texans organized ranging companies and later the famous Texas Rangers to protect settlements and pursue Comanche raiders. The Rangers were tough, skilled fighters who adopted some Comanche tactics, particularly the use of mounted combat with revolvers, which gave them firepower that matched or exceeded that of Comanche warriors. A key moment in Comanche-Texas relations came in 1838, when the Penateca Comanche captured a young girl named Matilda Lockhart. When she was returned during peace negotiations in San Antonio in 1840, she bore signs of horrible torture and abuse. The enraged Texans attempted to seize the Comanche chiefs who had come to negotiate, intending to hold them hostage for the return of other captives. The Comanche fought back, and a battle erupted in the council house. Most of the Comanche chiefs were killed, along with many warriors and even women and children who had accompanied them. The council house fight, as it came to be known, infuriated the Comanche. They organized a massive retaliatory raid that struck deep into Texas, reaching all the way to the coast at Linville, which they burned. On their way back, weighted down with plunder, the raiders were caught and defeated by Texas forces at the Battle of Plum Creek. This battle marked a turning point. It was one of the first times that Texas forces had won a clear victory over a large Comanche war party. Through the 1840s, the conflict continued. Comanche bands raided Texas settlements, taking horses and captives. Texas forces pursued raiders and attacked Comanche camps. Casualties mounted on both sides, but it was the Comanche who were gradually being pushed back. They still controlled the plains, but the Texas frontier was creeping westward. The situation became even more dire for the Comanche after Texas joined the United States in 1845. Now the Comanche faced not just the relatively limited resources of the Republic of Texas, but the full power of the U.S. government and its military. The Mexican-American War of 1846-1848 temporarily focused U.S. military attention elsewhere, giving the Comanche a brief respite, but once that war ended, the pressure on Comancheria intensified. The American encroachment. The United States approached the Comanche problem differently than Texas had. While military operations continued, the U.S. government also attempted a policy of treaties and reservations. The idea was to confine the Comanche and other Plains tribes to specific areas, allowing American settlement to proceed in the rest of the territory. The first significant treaty was the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851, which attempted to define the territories of various Plains tribes. However, many Comanche bands did not participate in or recognize this treaty. More relevant to the Comanche was the Treaty of Fort Atkinson in 1853, in which some Comanche and Kiowa leaders agreed to cease raiding and to accept American sovereignty in exchange for annuities and trade goods. But these treaties were problematic from the start. The U.S. government often failed to deliver the promised goods and support. The Comanche, meanwhile, did not have a centralized government that could enforce treaty terms on all bands. A chief who signed a treaty bound only himself and those who chose to follow him. Other bands, particularly the Quahadi and other northern divisions, had no interest in peace and continued raiding. The situation was further complicated by the diverse motivations and interests of various American groups. Army officers might want peace so they could focus on other threats. Indian agents might genuinely believe that reservations were the best hope for indigenous survival. Texas settlers wanted the Comanche eliminated or removed entirely. Traders wanted to continue profitable commerce, and many individual Americans saw opportunities for wealth in Comanche territory and pressured the government to open it for settlement regardless of treaties. The 1850s saw this conflict intensify. The U.S. Army established a line of forts across the Texas frontier, attempting to protect settlements and control Comanche movements. But the forts were widely spaced and couldn't stop determined raiders. Comanche warriors simply rode around the forts, struck undefended settlements, and vanished back onto the plains before troops could respond. One military tactic that did prove effective was the winter campaign. Comanche bands typically gathered in semi-permanent winter camps in sheltered locations where they could survive the harsh plains winter. These camps, with their large herds of horses and supplies of food, were vulnerable to attack. American forces discovered that if they could locate and attack these winter camps, they could inflict serious damage on Comanche bands, destroying their lodges, capturing or scattering their horse herds, and forcing the survivors to flee in the middle of winter. But even successful military campaigns couldn't stop the Comanche. The plains were simply too vast, the Comanche too mobile and resilient. They would suffer a defeat, retreat to recover, and then resume raiding. As one American officer noted with frustration, fighting the Comanche was like fighting smoke. You could scatter them, but you couldn't grasp them or pin them down. The Civil War era. The American Civil War, which erupted in 1861, had profound effects on Comancheria. With regular army troops withdrawn to fight in the war, frontier defenses collapsed. The Comanche took full advantage. Raids into Texas intensified dramatically. Entire regions that had been settled were abandoned as settlers fled eastward. The frontier actually receded by 100 miles or more in some areas. The Confederate government of Texas was far too occupied with the Civil War to mount effective operations against the Comanche. Confederate forces occasionally pursued raiders, but with little success. The Comanche may not have understood or cared much about the political reasons for the war, but they certainly recognized the opportunity it presented. They reclaimed territory they had lost and plundered settlements that had previously been relatively safe. Even after the Civil War ended in 1865, it took time for the United States to reorganize its frontier defenses. During this period, from roughly 1861 to 1867, the Comanche experienced a kind of golden age, a last flowering of their traditional way of life. Buffalo were still abundant on the plains. The Comanche controlled vast territories. Their military power was undiminished. True, American settlers were returning and the long-term trend was ominous, but in the moment, life was good. However, this period also saw intensifying conflict with other tribes. The Comanche had complex relationships with other plains peoples. They were allied with the Kiowa, a partnership so close that the two tribes are often spoken of together in historical accounts. They also had generally good relations with the Wichita and Caddo peoples, who lived on the eastern edge of the plains. But they were often at war with the Ute to the west, the Osage to the east, and various Apache bands. During the Civil War and immediately after, tension increased with the Cheyenne and Arapaho to the north. These tribes were themselves under pressure from American expansion and often found themselves competing with the Comanche for territory and resources. There were occasional clashes, though also periods of cooperation, particularly when various tribes united against common American enemies. The Medicine Lodge Treaty. In 1867, the United States government made a major attempt to establish a lasting peace with the Plains tribes. The Medicine Lodge Treaty, signed at Medicine Lodge Creek in Kansas, brought together representatives of the Comanche, Kiowa, Kiowa Apache, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The treaty established a reservation for the Comanche and Kiowa in what is now southwestern Oklahoma, north of the Red River. The treaty promised the Comanche and Kiowa that they would retain the right to hunt buffalo on the southern plains as long as the herds remained. In exchange, they agreed to cease raiding and to accept the reservation as their permanent home. The government promised to provide supplies, including food and farming equipment, to help the tribes transition to a settled, agricultural lifestyle. From the American perspective, the Medicine Lodge Treaty was the solution to the Comanche problem. The tribes would settle down on the reservation, learn to farm, and gradually assimilate into American society. The rest of the southern plains would be opened to settlement and development. From the Comanche perspective, things looked very different. The Comanche chiefs who signed the treaty understood it in their own terms. They thought they were agreeing to accept gifts from the government in exchange for temporary peace. The idea that they were permanently ceding the vast expanses of Comancheria was alien to their understanding. Land, from the Comanche perspective, couldn't be owned in the way Americans understood ownership. The plains belonged to those who could use them, who could defend them, who could live on them. Moreover, not all Comanche bands accepted the treaty. The Quahadi, led by chiefs who had refused to even attend the negotiations, rejected the entire agreement. They continued to live on the Llano Estacado, the staked plains of the Texas Panhandle, and they continued their traditional way of life, including raiding when the opportunity presented itself. Even among those bands that did move to the reservation area, compliance was partial and temporary. Young warriors still organized raids into Texas. Buffalo hunting expeditions ranged far from the reservation boundaries. Many Comanche lived on the reservation only during winter, when supplies were distributed, then returned to the plains in summer to hunt and live freely. The U.S. government, for its part, failed to live up to its treaty obligations. Supplies were often late, insufficient, or of poor quality. Corrupt Indian agents sometimes sold the supplies that were supposed to go to the tribes, pocketing the profits. The Comanche, who had agreed to peace partly based on promises of support, found those promises broken. The last 3 years. The late 1860s and early 1870s represented the final years of Comanche freedom. These were years of increasing desperation as the Comanche watched their world changing in ways they could not control. American settlement continued to expand westward. Towns sprouted where there had been only prairie. Railroads pushed across the plains, bringing with them a flood of settlers, buffalo hunters and soldiers. The buffalo, the foundation of Plains Indian life, came under assault. Commercial buffalo hunters, armed with powerful long-range rifles, descended on the southern plains. These hunters killed buffalo by the millions, not for meat or hides for personal use, but for commercial sale. Buffalo hides became a valuable commodity in eastern markets, used for industrial belts and winter coats. Buffalo bones were collected and shipped east to be ground into fertilizer. The slaughter was staggering in its scale and speed. In 1872, there were still millions of buffalo on the southern plains. By 1878, they were effectively extinct there. The great herds that had sustained Comanche life for generations were simply gone. The U.S. government did nothing to stop this slaughter. Indeed, some American officials openly supported it, recognizing that destroying the buffalo would destroy the ability of plains tribes to maintain their traditional way of life. For the Comanche, watching the buffalo disappear was watching their entire world collapse. Without buffalo, they couldn't survive on the plains. Without the freedom to hunt and move with the herds, their entire society couldn't function. They faced a stark choice: adapt to reservation life or starve. Some Comanche bands tried to resist. Raids into Texas intensified as warriors sought to drive out settlers and buffalo hunters. In some cases, buffalo hunters were specifically targeted in retaliation for the slaughter of the herds. But these raids only brought military retaliation, and the Comanche discovered that the balance of power had shifted decisively against them. The U.S. Army adopted new tactics specifically designed to defeat the Comanche. Instead of simply pursuing raiders, which had proven largely futile, the Army launched sustained campaigns into Comancheria itself. They targeted Comanche winter camps, destroying lodges, food supplies, and horse herds. They denied the Comanche rest and refuge. Column after column marched across the plains, hunting for Comanche bands. The most famous of these campaigns was the Red River War of 1874–1875. This was a coordinated operation involving multiple columns converging on the Texas Panhandle and the last Comanche strongholds. The campaign wasn't marked by large battles. The Comanche avoided direct confrontation with superior forces, but rather by relentless pursuit. Soldiers tracked Comanche bands through winter storms. They destroyed camp after camp. They captured or scattered horse herds, leaving the Comanche unable to move or hunt effectively. One significant engagement during this campaign was the Battle of Palo Duro Canyon in September 1874. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie led his forces in a surprise attack on a large encampment in Palo Duro Canyon, where several Comanche, Kiowa, and Southern Cheyenne bands had gathered. The warriors managed to escape, but Mackenzie's forces captured the camp, destroyed hundreds of lodges, and captured over 1,000 horses. Then, in a devastating blow, Mackenzie ordered most of the captured horses killed, denying them to the Indians and crippling their mobility. The final surrender. By the spring of 1875, the situation for the remaining free Comanche bands was desperate. They were starving, their horse herds were depleted or gone, and they were exhausted from constant flight and fighting. The buffalo were nearly extinct. The army was unrelenting in its pursuit, and winter had been brutal for those trying to survive on the plains without adequate shelter or supplies. Band after band came into Fort Sill in Indian Territory, Oklahoma, to surrender. They came in poor condition, hungry and dispirited. The last to come in were the Quahadi, the most defiant of all Comanche divisions. They held out through the winter and into spring, but even they could not continue indefinitely. In June 1875, the Quahadi chief Quanah Parker led the last free Comanche band in surrender at Fort Sill. Quanah was a remarkable figure. His father had been a Comanche war chief named Peter Nocona. His mother was Cynthia Ann Parker, a white woman who had been captured as a child in 1836 and raised as Comanche. Quanah had grown up fully Comanche and had become a respected war leader. Now, at perhaps 30 years old, he was leading his people into captivity. The surrender of Quanah Parker's band marked the end of Comanche independence. After nearly 2 centuries of freedom on the plains, during which they had built an empire, defeated multiple enemies, and maintained their way of life despite enormous pressures, the Comanche were now confined to a reservation, dependent on the government for food, forbidden to leave without permission, and expected to abandon their traditional culture and become sedentary farmers. For the warriors who had known freedom, who had ridden freely across vast expanses, who had lived by their skill and courage, this was a crushing defeat. Many fell into despair. Some turned to alcohol, which became a devastating problem on the reservation. The old ways were gone, and the new ways seemed alien and meaningless. But not all Comanche accepted defeat. They had survived the mountains, they had conquered the plains, and now they would find a way to survive the reservation. They would adapt as they had always adapted. The path forward wouldn't be the one they would have chosen, but they would walk it nonetheless. Reservation life and cultural persistence life on the reservation was difficult in ways that went beyond mere material hardship. The Comanche were expected to give up everything that had defined their society. The government agents wanted them to cut their hair, wear white man's clothing, learn English, convert to Christianity, and become farmers. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, where they were forbidden to speak Comanche, punished for any display of traditional culture, and subjected to forced assimilation. The government's policy toward Plains Indians in this era was explicitly assimilationist. The idea, captured in the infamous phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," was to eradicate indigenous cultures and remake indigenous peoples as English-speaking Christian Americans. This policy was pursued with missionary zeal by Indian agents, teachers, and missionaries who genuinely believed they were helping the Indians by civilizing them. For the Comanche, farming was particularly problematic. They were a people whose entire culture was built around mobility, hunting, and pastoralism. The idea of staying in one place, ploughing fields and tending crops, was not just unfamiliar but contrary to everything they valued. Moreover, much of the reservation land was unsuitable for farming. The soils were poor, water was scarce, and the climate was harsh. Many Comanche tried farming because they had no choice, but few succeeded. More successful was cattle ranching. The Comanche had always been horsemen and herders, and they adapted to cattle ranching more readily than to crop farming. Some Comanche began building up cattle herds, and in the late 1800s, several became successful ranchers. This wasn't the old way of life, but it was at least compatible with Comanche skills and values. The reservation system itself was troubled. The reservation was supposed to be Comanche and Kiowa land in perpetuity, protected from white encroachment. But almost immediately, there was pressure to open the reservation to white settlement. Railroads wanted right-of-way across the reservation. Cattlemen wanted to lease reservation grazing land. Settlers coveted the better farmland. And always, there were those who argued that the Indians had more land than they needed and that it was wasteful for so much land to be unproductive. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act, also called the General Allotment Act. This law authorized the government to divide reservation lands into individual allotments that would be assigned to individual Indians. The stated goal was to encourage private property ownership and farming. Each family head would receive 160 acres, single adults would receive 80 acres, and so on. After all Indians had received allotments, any remaining surplus land would be opened to white settlement. The Dawes Act was a disaster for most tribes. It broke up communal landholdings, which had been a key source of indigenous power and identity. It forced a system of individual property ownership that was alien to most indigenous cultures. And the surplus land provisions meant that tribes lost millions of acres. The Comanche and Kiowa reservation, which had initially encompassed about 3 million acres, was drastically reduced as land was allotted, and then much of the remainder opened to white settlement. But despite all these pressures and hardships, Comanche culture did not die. The people maintained their language, at least among themselves. They continued to tell the old stories to their children and grandchildren. They practiced their religious ceremonies, though often in secret to avoid interference from agents and missionaries. They maintained their social structures and their identity as Comanche, as Numunu. The peyote religion, also known as the Native American Church, became important to many Comanche and other Oklahoma tribes during this period. This religion combined indigenous spirituality with some Christian elements and centered on the ceremonial use of peyote, a cactus with psychoactive properties. For many Comanche, the peyote religion provided a way to maintain spiritual connection and community in the difficult reservation years. Quanah Parker and adaptation. No single figure better represents the Comanche experience in the early reservation years than Quanah Parker. After leading the last free Comanche band in surrender, Quanah emerged as the principal chief and spokesman for the Comanche people. This was itself a significant change. Traditionally, the Comanche had never had a single paramount chief. Each band had its own leaders, and no one spoke for all the Comanche. But in dealing with the US government, a unified leadership was necessary, and Quanah stepped into that role. Quanah was in many ways perfectly positioned for this role. His mixed heritage, his mother had been white, gave him some insight into American culture and society. He learned to speak English fluently. He understood that the old ways were gone forever, and that survival required adaptation. At the same time, he remained proudly Comanche, never denying his heritage or apologizing for his people's past. Quanah became a skilled negotiator and advocate for his people. He fought to protect Comanche interests as much as possible in dealings with the government. He argued against allotment, recognizing that it would result in massive land losses, though ultimately he couldn't prevent it. He advocated for better rations, better schools, better treatment of his people. At the same time, Quanah adopted many aspects of American life. He became a successful rancher, building up a large cattle herd. He built a large house, the Star House, which became famous as one of the finest homes in the area. He dressed in a combination of traditional and American clothing, often photographed wearing a business suit, but with his hair in traditional braids. He traveled to Washington, D.C. to negotiate with government officials, and even rode in Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural parade in 1905. Yet Quanah never fully assimilated. He maintained multiple wives despite government and missionary pressure to practice monogamy. He defended the use of peyote in religious ceremonies and became a leader in the Native American church. He walked a careful line, adopting enough of American culture to be accepted and to work effectively with American officials, while maintaining core aspects of Comanche identity and culture. Quanah became famous beyond the Comanche nation. He was celebrated in American popular culture as the ideal of the civilized Indian, someone who had successfully transitioned from savage warrior to American citizen. This celebration was often patronizing and failed to recognize the profound losses the Comanche had suffered or the challenges they continued to face. But Quanah skillfully used his fame to advocate for his people and to maintain their interests. When Quanah Parker died in 1911, he was buried at Fort Sill with full military honors. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including many prominent Americans. His death marked the end of an era. He was the last chief to remember the days of freedom, the last major leader who had lived the old Comanche way of life. The 20th century. The 20th century brought continued challenges and changes for the Comanche. The early decades were difficult. The reservation system continued to restrict Comanche freedom and autonomy. Poverty was widespread. Disease, particularly tuberculosis, took a heavy toll. The boarding school system continued to remove children from their families and communities, disrupting the transmission of culture and language. World War I brought a new relationship with the United States military. Many Comanche men enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving with distinction. This began a tradition of military service that would continue throughout the century. In World War II, Comanche soldiers again served, and some became famous as code talkers, using the Comanche language to transmit military communications that Japanese forces could not decode. The use of Comanche code talkers in World War II was a point of pride for the Comanche nation. Here was the language that the government had tried to suppress, that children had been punished for speaking in boarding schools, now being used to help win the war. 17 Comanche soldiers served as code talkers, and their contributions were significant to military operations in Europe. The mid-20th century saw gradual improvement in conditions for many Comanche. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 ended allotment and provided for some tribal self-governance. The Comanche Nation, along with other Oklahoma tribes, began to develop their own governmental structures and to have more say in their own affairs. In 1966, the Comanche adopted a constitution and established a formal tribal government. This government, while operating within the framework of U.S. federal law, provided the Comanche with more autonomy than they had enjoyed in decades. They could now manage their own affairs, make decisions about economic development, and preserve their culture on their own terms. Economic development became a priority. The Comanche Nation developed various business enterprises to generate revenue and provide employment for tribal members. This included ranching operations, which built on the historical Comanche connection to horses and herding. Later developments included gaming operations, which became a significant source of tribal revenue, as well as other businesses. Cultural preservation also became a focus. The Comanche Nation worked to preserve their language, which was in danger of dying out as older speakers passed away and younger generations spoke primarily English. Language classes were established. Cultural programs taught traditional crafts, dances, and practices. The annual Comanche Nation Fair became an important event where Comanche could gather, celebrate their heritage, and pass traditions to the next generation. The modern Comanche Nation today. The Comanche Nation continues to exist as a federally recognized tribe with headquarters in Lawton, Oklahoma. The nation has approximately 17,000 enrolled members, though not all live in Oklahoma. Comanche people are found throughout the United States, pursuing careers in all fields, living in cities and on rural lands, connected to their heritage in various ways. The Comanche Nation operates like a modern government. It has an elected tribal council that makes decisions on behalf of the nation. It provides services to tribal members, including healthcare, education support, and social services. It manages tribal properties and businesses. It represents Comanche interests in dealings with federal and state governments. Economically, the nation has diversified beyond the gaming and ranching that were early focuses of development. The Comanche Nation has various business enterprises, from retail stores to industrial operations. These businesses provide employment and generate revenue that supports tribal programs and services. Education has become a priority. The Comanche Nation operates a college in Lawton that offers associate degrees and vocational training. Scholarships are available for Comanche students attending other colleges and universities. The goal is to ensure that young Comanche have the education they need to succeed in the modern economy while also learning about and taking pride in their heritage. Cultural preservation remains vitally important. The Comanche language, which is still spoken by some elders but is endangered, is the subject of intensive preservation efforts. Language classes, recording projects, and language immersion programs all work to keep the language alive. Traditional dances, including the famous Comanche powwow dances, are practiced and performed. Traditional arts and crafts are taught and celebrated. The Comanche Nation has also worked to tell their own story and to preserve their history. The nation operates cultural centers and museums. They have worked with historians, anthropologists, and filmmakers to ensure that Comanche history is told accurately and from the Comanche perspective. This includes reclaiming artifacts and remains from museums and repatriating them to the nation. Spiritually, many Comanche continue to practice the Native American Church, which remains an important part of Comanche religious life. Others practice Christianity, often in forms that incorporate indigenous elements. Some Comanche practice traditional Comanche spirituality, maintaining connections to the old ways, and many incorporate elements of all of these, creating a spiritual life that is uniquely their own. The Comanche have not forgotten their history or their ancestors. They honor the warriors who fought to preserve Comanche freedom. They remember the chiefs who led in times of crisis. They maintain connections to sacred sites and to the lands that were once Comancheria. They tell the stories of the past to their children, ensuring that the next generation knows who they are and where they come from. At the same time, the Comanche look to the future. They work to ensure that Comanche people have opportunities for education and economic success. They advocate for policies that benefit indigenous peoples. They participate fully in American society while maintaining their distinct identity as Comanche. They have survived conquest, forced assimilation, poverty, and disease. They have adapted as they have always adapted, and they continue. Legacy and reflection. The story of the Comanche is remarkable in many ways. It is a story of a people who saw opportunity and seized it, transforming themselves from small mountain bands into the masters of a vast empire. It is a story of military prowess and adaptation, of warriors who became legends. It is a story of freedom, of a people who valued autonomy and mobility above all else, and who fought desperately to preserve those values. It is also a story of tragedy and loss. The Comanche lost their independence, their lands, and much of their traditional way of life. They suffered through decades of hardship on reservations. They saw their children taken away to boarding schools. They watched their language and culture come under assault. The buffalo, the foundation of their world, were driven to near extinction. The plains, which had been their home, were taken from them and divided up among settlers. But it is also a story of resilience and survival. The Comanche did not disappear. They did not cease to exist as a people. Despite everything they suffered, despite all attempts to eradicate their culture and identity, they persisted. They adapted to new circumstances while maintaining continuity with the past. They found ways to be Comanche in a world that no longer had room for the traditional Comanche way of life. The Comanche story offers lessons about the nature of colonialism and its impact on indigenous peoples. It demonstrates the brutality of Euro-American expansion and the willingness of settlers and governments to use overwhelming force to seize indigenous lands. It shows the gap between noble rhetoric about treaties and civilization, and the harsh reality of violence and dispossession. But the story also reveals indigenous agency and resistance. The Comanche were not passive victims. They fought back with skill and determination. They adapted their strategies and tactics. They negotiated when it served their interests and fought when negotiation failed. They made choices, good and bad, that shaped their own destiny. Even in defeat, they made decisions about how to respond, how to preserve what could be preserved, how to build a future for their children. The Comanche experience also illuminates the power of cultural persistence. Despite sustained efforts to eliminate Comanche culture, despite the boarding schools and the missionaries, despite the economic pressures and social discrimination, Comanche identity survived. The language, though endangered, still exists. The stories are still told, the dances are still performed. Young Comanche today learn about their history and take pride in their heritage. The connection to the past, though attenuated, has not been broken. In recent decades, there has been a growing recognition of the injustices suffered by indigenous peoples and a greater willingness to listen to indigenous voices and perspectives. The Comanche have been part of this broader movement. They have worked to correct historical inaccuracies, to ensure their story is told from their perspective, to reclaim their history and culture. They have advocated for policies that respect indigenous sovereignty and support indigenous communities. The relationship between the Comanche and the broader American society continues to evolve. there is still much work to be done to address historical injustices and contemporary challenges facing indigenous communities. Issues of poverty, health disparities, educational access, and cultural preservation remain significant. The Comanche, like other indigenous nations, continue to navigate the complex realities of being a sovereign nation within the United States. But there is also reason for hope. The Comanche Nation is stronger today than it has been in generations. Economically, culturally, politically, the nation is viable and growing. Young Comanche are learning their language and culture. The nation has the resources and autonomy to chart its own course. The Comanche have survived, and they are not merely surviving, but building a future. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through Comanche history, we can reflect on what we have learned. We have seen a people emerge from the mountains and transform themselves into masters of the plains. We have witnessed their golden age when they controlled an empire and were feared and respected across a vast territory. We have watched their desperate struggle to maintain their freedom in the face of overwhelming forces. And we have followed their path from conquest to survival to renewal. The Comanche story is uniquely theirs, but it also resonates with broader human themes. It is about the capacity of humans to adapt to new environments and opportunities. It is about the power of freedom and the willingness to fight for it. It is about the tragedy of cultural collision and the often brutal nature of colonization. It is about resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. And it is about the persistence of identity and culture, even under the most difficult circumstances. For nearly 2 centuries, the Comanche were the dominant power on the southern plains. They were not perfect. They could be brutal to their enemies. They practiced slavery. They engaged in practices that we would today consider cruel. But they were also people trying to survive and thrive in a challenging world, making the best choices they could with the information and options available to them. They built a society and culture that worked remarkably well for their environment and circumstances. When that world changed, when American expansion made their traditional way of life impossible, the Comanche faced choices that would determine their fate. Some chose to fight to the bitter end. Others chose to seek accommodation. Most simply tried to find a way to survive and preserve what they could of their way of life. There were no good choices, only difficult ones, and the Comanche made them as best they could. Today, the Comanche remain. They have survived as a people, maintained their identity, and adapted to the modern world. They contribute to their communities and to American society while remaining distinctly Comanche. They honor their ancestors and their history while building a future for generations yet to come. Their story is not over but continues to unfold. As you rest tonight, perhaps you can imagine the vast plains as they once were, stretching endless under enormous skies. You can picture Comanche riders moving across that landscape, masters of a world that was theirs. You can sense the tragedy of what was lost and the strength required to survive that loss. And you can appreciate the endurance of the Comanche people who have walked a long and difficult road with dignity and strength. The story of the Comanche is a story of America, a thread in the complex tapestry of this continent's history. It reminds us that history is not simple, that there are perspectives beyond the familiar narratives, and that the past continues to shape the present in profound ways. It calls us to remember, to honor, and to learn. The Comanche remember. They remember the days of freedom and power. They remember the struggles and the losses. They remember who they are and where they came from. And they continue forward, still Comanche, still Numunu, still the people. Their story ancient and modern, tragic and triumphant, continues. And in that continuation, in that persistence, there is something profoundly hopeful. Rest well tonight and carry with you the story of the Comanche, the lords of the southern plains, a people who built an empire, fought for their freedom, and survived to carry their identity and culture into the future. Their legacy endures, and their story deserves to be remembered and honored.